I'd like to give you the word to introduce Norman for today's session.
Yes. Hi everyone. Um, Hello, Susan, and hello, Norman. Thank you for being with us. I just very briefly want to welcome you in this community,
Thank you.
and it's a pleasure to see you. Um, we talked a few months ago, and we had the idea of this conference tonight. So thank you, NextGen, for making this happen. Norman, I thought that you could be a great speaker in this community because you are, I think, the first who introduced the notion of living organization. I'm not sure, but I think you are. But if you're not, you've been one of the very first, or probably the first. And what I love about the work you've done, you're a very seasoned consultant. You work in different in corporations at very high level in transformation. But your vision and your view of living organization and seeing the organization as a human being, your metaphor with the human being, I think it's very interesting. And the depths of your understanding of what is transformation and what it takes to transform ourselves, and what it takes to transform the organization. I think it's a great insight. So I'm very happy that you can share that with us today. So yeah, that's it. So maybe you will introduce more yourself and your work, but just wanted to say that.
Yes, so hi to Norman, and I would just like to say a few words on how we will run this conference tonight. So Norman, he agreed to give us an introduction to the concept and of the living organization, what is he wrote about actually in this fantastic book. Um, so I can really recommend it, and I think some others have you have it as well, Mikael.
Of
And I
course.
was really happy to read that book, Norman. And what there is a lot to say of what you've experienced. We found out that we share a past in the aviation, like the first career steps. We shared that, and you were actually observing and developing this from a perspective which is special. And you were a CEO yourself for a long time, and I think that's really the new perspective that you're adding. And your book was written in 2011. Um, you're quoted by Frédéric Laloux in Reinventing Organizations because you have that specific and special view. So maybe can you share? So in your book, you're writing what your purpose is. What is your personal purpose that you bring to the world before we go into the sequence?
So for the longest time, my well, still is my purpose. It's really driven by the fact that, as you point out, I've been a leader of organizations for many years, and then consulting with leaders. And one of the things that really impacted me and, quite frankly, saddened me was how the environment, how much organizations affect people's lives. We live so many hours, we spend so many hours in organizational life, and in how organizations have, I'll just say, the sadness of seeing people not really rise to their full potential in organizations. And on top of that, organizations aren't very good at achieving what they want to achieve. So we have a society that doesn't help the people who are there to achieve something get better at achieving it, and organizations aren't really achieving what they want. So my purpose really comes down to transforming organizations to um, honor and respect and support the dignity of the human spirit, that creative spark that enables all of us, and individually and collectively, to really make a positive impact on society.
We were talking yesterday, so your book is called The Living Organization, and we found out actually that there is a difference in perspective, because when you read Laloux, Frédéric Laloux, he's talking about an organization as a living organism. And can you maybe, just to start, say, like, what is the differentiation on how you perceive this before we dig into the living organization and the introduction of what you wrote about in your book.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. Yes, I was in conversation with somebody years ago, and we had this very question. He kept saying, it was actually with Giles Hutchins, which many of you might know. He's also part of the biomimicry, nature-based work, and we've actually co-authored a couple of papers together. And in that, I kept feeling a disturbance, if you will, a disconnect with the concept that organizations were living systems. And what I came to discover, if you look at, I mean, we all talk about organizations as machines of production, and we all know that's not good. And so we're moving to organizations as living systems, which is move in the right direction, because living systems, as everybody, Lalou and Childs and many others recognize, living systems are much more adaptive. They're connected to an ecosystem and all of that. But I felt organizations had another quality, and this is why I call them living beings. If you look at the underlying rules by which something operates, call it its underlying operating system, a machine its operating system is programmed from the outside. A living system's operating system is programmed through its evolutionary purpose, as Lalou calls it, right? It evolves over time and responds to its environments, and through evolution, it kind of defines who and what it is, its purpose, and how it exists in the world. So a bird will never be a fish. A fish will never fly. When you look at human beings, there's something uniquely different about that. Sure, we're part of a living systems, and we have all those attributes, and we are affected by our genetic evolution. But we have a power that nobody else has, and they call it the power of imagination. We literally create realities out of our own minds through the stories we tell, what I call the context of our life. And we have the power to frame that context. And this is a phenomenal gift. It's also a phenomenal responsibility. So that's the differentiation. Human beings are very fundamentally different than living systems. We can fly if we choose. We can dive deep into the ocean if we choose. We can even go to the moon or Mars, or destroy the planet, or make the planet healthy. I mean, we have this power of choice that nobody else has. So that's the difference.
Mm-hmm. And you were saying yesterday in our preparation discussion that it's as well the communication that is specific to human beings. So we can
What? I'm sorry, what was that?
the communication, the verbal
Yes.
exchange that we can have to really like exchange on concepts and views, etc.
Yeah, I mean, we know plants and fish and animals communicate as well. But the notion of, excuse me, let me just shut this down. I apologize. It's not only that we communicate in language, that's a strength, but the language gives us the ability to create a reality. So language takes on a different meaning than just a communication of information back and forth. So that's a difference.
So if I understand or you correctly, you are saying it's more than the metaphor of the human body with the organs and the cells, because there is something that goes beyond, and it's not only a living organism, but really there is a specific attribute to that.
Yeah, yep. And I'll get into
I
that
don't want
more.
to extend that discussion because we are certainly passing through stuff. So we agreed that you would do a 15 minutes presentation to run through the concepts of what you've described in the book. And after that, I suggest, since we are a rather small community tonight, that after that you would like switch on your videos and that we are having a question and answer quite freely later on. So it's fully okay if you switch off your video, but later on, I would love to see your faces so that we can have a dialogue just after. The floor is yours, Norman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that opening. It nicely sets the stage. and probably covers a few points. So as Mikhail said, I created this process or this framework, started it 15 years ago, or started to document it 15 years ago. It comes out of my history, as I pointed out earlier, um, why organizations aren't achieving better results. As a leader of an organization, results is the number one um, um, definer of his success, not just for the leader, but for the organization. And I'll touch on that a little bit, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions about that. And just to be clear, I'm not the first one to coin the term living organization. A professor many years ago wrote a book called The Living Organization. I think it was written back in the 70s or 80s. And he did a lot of correlation between organization life and living systems models. His name was Tracy. But I took a different approach. As I mentioned, I'm interested in how do we create outcomes? How do we create results individually and collectively? Since this is a conversation about what I call the bridge to the new way of working, I thought I'd start by just taking a look at some of the principles underlying the many, many movements out there that we all are involved with: Agile, conscious capitalism, lean, teal, self-management. There's a lot of overlap in their core principles, as you can see. We have a lot of focus on purpose, on wholeness, on self-management, on the individual and the interactions. Respect for people is, and giving power to people is one of the underlying aspects to it. But if we look at how we create results, there's a dominant way. And I suspect if you step back and think about the outcomes you want to create in your personal life, you will see a lot of what you might call the mechanistic approach to creating results. For example, you focus on what it is you want to create, what you want to produce. So there's a very strong production or doing aspect to it. Most organizations structure around hierarchies in one form or another. There's a really interesting reason that happens. It has a lot to do with the role of the leader. Right? The leader it holds the responsibility to program the machine. Now, I say it that way. If you back away from the term program the machine, and you talk about it in business terms, you'll say the leader and the leadership team are the ones that set the strategy. And they define where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. And then everybody executes that. And that's the general paradigm in business. Well, if you're going to be the one setting the strategy, then you hold the power. Everything has to go through you, and then it filters down, hierarchical structures. So a lot of the things we see are really byproducts of a certain core set of fundamental beliefs as defined here. Specialization. We want to optimize our efficiency, and the best way to do that is specialize. Specialize leads to silos. So you can see there's a lot of unintended consequences for what we want. And if we compare the two to each other, you can see there's what I would call a real disconnect. In fact, what we're really trying to do with things like Agile, lean, self-management, teal, is trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. And that's why it's not working. So either we got to square the peg or round the hole. One or the other has to happen. And if we look at the new ways of working as the peg, we probably want to find a way to round the hole. And that's really what the living organization framework is all about. And these are the 5 or 6 things I'm going to talk about in this brief overview. And we'll have a chance afterwards to delve into any one of those. But I just wanted to give you a brief overview. I look at the living organization as an integrated and holistic approach to creating outcomes. And to do that, you have to change some of the core beliefs. Before I get into the principles of it, let me give you an idea of what we've been able to achieve with organizations. So obviously the focus is on creating results. So it's nice to know that we've been able to have organizations create the desired outcomes, not only more effectively, actually achieve them, but do it faster. That in itself would be really nice. But what was interesting is in the process of doing that, now remember, we're focused on helping them achieve their goals. We were able to increase engagement. We were able to make them more responsive and pivot to changes. We've almost completely eliminated silos. They operate from a completely collaborative point of view. And I love the comment from the CEO in one particular company that said, you know, I am finding it amazing how people are taking responsibilities away from me. I don't have to worry about things I used to worry about. I'm not involved in managing conflict. They're doing it on their own. We did not set up engagement projects. We did not set up eliminating silo projects. We did not set up culture products. We set up a program to achieve better results. And these were all byproducts of that. So what do I mean when I say an organization is a living being? Well, if you look at a living being, as we talked about earlier briefly, you have certain characteristics, and the top among them is they're not only responsive, they're not only agile, and they not only learn and adapt, they have this quality of creativity and imagination. So we have the ability as a living person to create whatever we want if we focus on it. We also operate from a certain sense of social connection and values. And these govern our choices. It's really important to remember that. Again, living systems don't necessarily need values because they don't have choice. They just do what they do. Human beings have choice, and therefore having values helps make choices. But now let's look at a department like sales and operations and finance or accounting. And if you step back and think about it, those departments also have certain personalities. Right? Sales as a person or as a collective of individuals operates with a unique personality that's common to everybody in sales. They even have certain beliefs that guide their decisions. Very different than accounting does. So you can look at a department as if it was a person, governed by its values, governed by its belief systems, governed by its goals and objectives, governed by what it wants to create and how it wants to create it. And they're very different. Just like me and my wife, I'm an engineer, she's an artist. We're very different. You can take that a step further and look at an organization and think about Apple versus Microsoft. Think about Amazon versus Google. Think about Apple versus Amazon. And they all have very different personalities, and they're governed by different values and operate fundamentally different based on that. Here's the important thing. The people within, the living beings within the larger collective adapt the ways of being of the collective they're part of. Everybody here joined the Next Gen Enterprise Collective. You joined it for two reasons. One, there's a common value base. And two, you begin to adapt and take on the collective norms. That's the way human beings operate. That's why at the beginning I said we're social beings, because we naturally take on that. Think of it from a organization leader's point of view. I had one CEO tell me that when this concept really clicked in him, he said, "Oh, I don't have to worry about 100 people in my organization. I just have to change the context of the collective, and it will affect the individuals within." Think about that from an OD perspective. You don't have to work with 100 people. You just have to work with 5 living collectives. So if an organization's a living being and we want to focus on getting results, getting outcomes, how do we do that? Well, first of all, you know you're going to do stuff, right? You got to physically take action. You're not going to sit around. We haven't got the capacity yet, and I say yet because there's some that believe it's possible, to sit on the top of a hill and meditate and create outcomes. So we're still in the process of doing things. So we do stuff, but we don't typically do it alone. So we have our interactions. We interact with others in our doing. Now, our interactions really have an impact on our doing in many ways. Just think about being part of a group that is less than harmonious, has some conflict, has some tension between them. And that's going to affect what you do and how you do it. Because you're going to spend a lot of time and energy focused on the dynamics of the interactions. Think of another group where things are just really clicking. That's going to heighten your ability to get things done because you can draw on that collective energy. There's another thing that human beings have that is added to it, and it's what I call who we are being. So think of it this way. Imagine doing anything and you have 3 people doing the exact same action. Coding a program or delivering a presentation or writing a report, preparing a report, whatever activity you can think of. The first person is quite neutral. You typical, I don't want to say typical. The person who comes in, gets the work done, goes home, doesn't complain, but doesn't get really excited. The neutral one. They'll get the job done and it'll probably be okay. Then there's the disgruntled one, the one who just hates what they're doing, does it because they have to, has no sense of commitment to it. As a matter of fact, doesn't even like what they're doing. They'll get the job done, but think about what that's like. And then the other end of the scale, think about the person who's really excited about it, loves what they do, feels that who they are being is enhanced by what they're doing. Now, you got 3 people. The activity doesn't change. Changing the process or the flow of the activity, improving, optimizing the activity is not going to be impacted. It's not going to impact the outcomes. Changing their orientation to doing what they're doing will have a huge impact on the outcomes. So if you look at outcomes and how we get it, it's a function of the activity we do, as well as the relationships around that activity. But the real leverage item is what we call the context. Who are they being? What core belief systems are they bringing to the equation? What limitations are they bringing? What possibilities are they bringing? What sense of engagement are they bringing? So activity, relationship, and context are 3 areas to pay attention to when you're figuring out solutions to problems. Most solutions are fundamentally oriented just around activity. And that's one of the shortcomings of our current business models. We're beginning to play with relationships, but very, very few people are playing with context, consciously playing with context. Unconsciously, of course, there's always a context, but consciously playing with it, working with it, aligning it to the goals we want to achieve. Very few people are doing it. And Suzanne mentioned Laloux's reference to my work in his book. He literally says that the pioneering CEOs in his study are ones who, without naming it or even understanding the framework, start with context. And because of that, they create what seems to be magic. That's a quick paraphrase of his quote. So here we have management. Now remember, a leader's responsibility is fundamentally to create outcomes. And we could talk about what an outcome is. We could talk about profit, and probably will. But let's just say leaders must create the outcomes that make their organization successful. And right now, most leaders, for the longest time, most leaders focused on what we typically call the hard side of business, the results side, the numbers side, the process side, the structure of the organization, the goals, the metrics. In the middle of the 20th century, 50, 60 years ago, the notion of the soft side of business began to be introduced, and it's been a dominant theme, and most organization development consultants focus on that. And now think of a leader's position. He's got a certain amount of resources, he's got to allocate them. Which way does he go? The hard side or the soft side? And how does he know allocating the soft side will actually produce the hard side results? So unwittingly, we put the leader in a terrible position of choosing between one or the other. And many OD consultants often make the hard side wrong, right? You should care about the people and the planet more than profits. Yeah, profits are important, but the people, that's what really gets you the results. Now, intuitively, they know that, but nobody's ever come along and said, well, how do they link? That's what we address in the living organization. We bring the two together. As I said in my earlier thing, I don't have to focus on the soft side. That's a natural outgrowth. It's a natural outgrowth because I look at the organization as a living being. And by definition, living beings have a context. And by definition, the context drives what they create. So if I want to change what they're creating, I focus on changing the context. Oh, by the way, when I'm changing the context, I'm working on the soft side. So it's a byproduct. I can completely focus on the hard side results and have a tremendous impact on the soft side of things, and vice versa. So it's an integrated approach. And how do we do that? Well, everything in an organization is done by strategy. That's where the CEO or organization leader lives. I will also suggest that you as an individual live there too. You have a goal for the next 5 years for your life or your business. Right? You have some strategy to get you there. So strategy isn't just big, fancy corporate offsite strategy sessions. Strategy is just a simple roadmap of how I'm going to go from where I am to where I want to go. Everybody has at every level of an organization, every department has some strategy of how they're going to be successful. So why not tap into that as the core of how we implement what we want to implement? We have a variation of a balanced scorecard approach because it's an integrated approach. It covers all elements of a business. We look at the people side as building capacity, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But as we go through all of this, we're always looking at all three dimensions that I mentioned earlier. Because if we just looked at the activity, which a lot of strategy sessions look at, what are we going to do? And we don't pay attention to how the relationship's affecting that and whether our context is aligned to where we want to go and how that's affecting it. And we don't make all this explicit in our goals and objectives and our metrics. This will undermine you. Hence 70% failure rate. I mentioned that the people side is all about building capacity. In the old days, capacity was really thought as plant and equipment. How much space do I have? How many machines do I have? What's the throughput we can get through the factory? But in today's world, capacity is really defined by the capability and maturity of the people and, in fact, the organization as a whole. And maturity is the key to it all. So if I have low mature people, think of them like children. You're not going to give children a lot of freedom to choose. They require strong direction. Low mature people, again, think of a 5-year-old. It's all about me. Right? Don't want I tell this story because it just happened recently. My daughter decided to change her hairstyle, and she's had that hairstyle for as long as I've known her. And she decided she wanted to have a hairstyle with bangs. Her 4-year-old saw her and flipped out, crying, upset, wouldn't talk to her for an hour. Talk about resisting change. Low maturities can't handle change. They like stability. He did finally say, "Mommy, I don't like you here, but I still love you. You can still be my mommy." So they do come around eventually. And look at the high maturity side. These are people who can accept different points of view. They like to work on their own. They can handle making decisions on their own. They know how to manage their time, their energy. They accept change more readily because they're used to it. They like different viewpoints. They like a lot of fluidity. So imagine an organization of low maturity versus high maturity. Where would you get more output? So as a leader, I want to take a developmental leadership approach and to move people up that scale. That's the number one role of a leader in the future. Well, actually today in our model. You also look at this from the activity and relationship and context point of view. What you find is you got high activity-based orientation in the low maturity side and almost non-existent context. In the high maturity side, the relationship shifts. So again, by looking at activity, relationship, and context as variables in the equation, we have much more leverage to achieve the goals we want. I mentioned the leader's role at the beginning, and this is my closing slides. If the leader's role is to plan, organize, lead, and control, then the complement of that is to simply do, obey, follow, and report. That's why we have what we have in an organization. We don't, it's not that we have greedy leaders who don't care about employees. They do. They just have a mindset, a way of creating results based on years and years of being told how to be a leader. Hence the square hole. So we have to shift the mindset of a leader's role. And this is one of the things we really focus on, is how to help leaders get into this new mindset, which is really focus on the context, right? Understand what that is and frame it so it supports what you want to accomplish, so the magic can happen. Focus on developing the people, grow the maturity. Don't build teams, build community. And being in service, if you think about it, how am I in service to people? I deliver what I say I'm going to deliver. What I promise is what I give them. So that shifts the people's role, the employee's role, to everything we want. Powerful, choiceful people who are engaged, who are growing and mature and deliver the outcomes. They deliver the outcome. They're the ones doing it anyway. The leaders aren't doing it. And this is what we teach in our workshop, which we have one coming up on May 11th. We teach the 5 key skills of road mapping, because that's where it all starts. How to move into the heart center, so you balance the head and the heart. How do you create this take advantage of this creative, imaginative storytelling aspect? And how do you build rituals and scaffolding to support a new context? How to have an improvisation mindset. There's a whole group of people that know how to deal with uncertainty. They do it all the time. Jazz musicians, improv performers, improv comedians. They're actually trained to do that. And we draw from a lot of that work. And integrating opposites, that's we draw from Brian Johnson's work on polarity thinking. But it's a way of recognizing that the world is basically a duality, and there's always value on both sides of the equation. And how do you find that place in the middle? Centralization versus decentralization, individual versus collective. You have all sorts of polarities that you're dealing with. So as the title says, if we want to go from what we have to what we want, we can't just have, go to leaders and say, hey, trust us, it'll be better over there in the new island. Look at these people, look at what Frederick Laloux writes about. That they go, wow, great, how do I do that? And most of us say, oh, just jump, trust us, it'll work. The living organization was designed to be the bridge. And with that, it took a little bit more time than I said I would, Suzanne. I'm sorry, but let's now enter into Q&A. That's the overview, and we can now begin the dialogue.
Have to put my micro on. Thank you very much, Norman, for this introduction. And I suggest that if you don't mind switching on your camera so that we can have an exchange. And I would actually open the floor first to some questions about what Norman just has presented. And if there is any reaction to it as well, I would take that as a second step. So thanks for showing your faces. And since we are a small group, when you want to speak, I suggest you just switch on your mic and you take the word. So, like, are there any questions that rose during the presentation of Norman? And I would open the floor. Michael.
Just can ask a question, Norman. If you could, we understand the importance of context, and that's really the key, maybe, of for leaders to work on the context, as you explained that. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what are the elements of the context? I think there's a lot more to say. You mentioned values, but I think there is more to that. So I was just curious to hear you more on that and what it means concretely for a leader to work on the context. What is at his hand that he can do?
Yeah, I'll say this about context. If we look at creating outcomes, if we have outcome A and we want to create outcome B, we know we have to change our behaviors, right? Whatever the behavior patterns that are producing the outcome A will not, if we keep doing those behaviors, we'll never get outcome B, right? That old saying, do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome, is the definition of insanity. But where do our behaviors come from? 90% of your behaviors are unconscious automatic responses to events. A customer calls an order desk. The person answering the call has a certain pattern of behavior that's been created over time. They're going to respond that way almost automatically. They're not going to think about how to pick up the phone, what to say, how to say it. They're going to have this, right? So if patterns of behavior are automatic, where does the definition of how to respond, where is that stored? Well, that's where context is. So think about context. If the body operates from a sort of a DNA, so the cells of the body know what to do based on DNA structures, and they divide and respond to events, and context you could think of as the psychic DNA. It defines how we behave. And don't have time to go into all the details here. So, but what I'll say is it's a set of stories that we created over time in response to life experiences. And an organization as a collective creates a set of collective stories. And those stories get stored in the collective DNA or psychic DNA of the organization. And when the event happens, they will respond accordingly. That's why we experience resistance to change. It's not resistance to change, it's just we operate out of habitual patterns. So learning how to work with context is learning how to unpack the existing stories, i.e. reveal what they are, reveal why they're valuable because they were created for a good reason, reframe how those used to be valuable but aren't anymore, create a new story, and then understand existing what we call scaffolding, which could be formal structures such as performance systems or informal rituals that the organization just adapts. Um, Understand what the scaffolding is and create scaffolding that supports the news story. That's a shorthand version of the context, which we spent 2 whole sessions in our workshop just learning how to do that. So it's a great question. It's a deep question. I hope I gave enough of an explanation to understand what it really the depth of it and why it's so important.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Norman. And is it right that there is as well a slight difference in your perception of it, that it's really listening to real stories, whereas when we look at Laloux's book, it's about listening to the purpose and dancing with it, and you're saying actually it's about sharing true stories? Or is there as well something that you refer to, like listening to the field? Or in your book you're writing as well about energy, so is there things that are conscious to everybody, or are there unconscious parts as well?
As I said earlier, 90% of our context is unconscious. So in order to work with it, we have to make it conscious. And there's, how do I want to describe it? Context, just like entering into a room and having a sense about the tone or the feel of the group, which I'm sure you've all experienced. You walk into a room and you can just feel, oh my God, this group is just depressed. and you know that. Now, it's not because anybody said anything, right? It's because you walked in and you felt something. Well, that's the way you work with these invisible or unconscious forces you begin to tune into. And this is why working with the head and the heart is important. The heart is the place where you feel those things. So that's part of why we teach that heart-centered wisdom skill, is because without that, you can't tune into it. You only have rational stories, which are projections and filters. And so you have to get down to the energy. That also holds true in communicating with people. So teaching those skills are really critical.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to give the floor to Wolfgang. You were commenting in the chat, and I don't know whether you want to share that by talking about it. You can unmute. Yeah, super.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. First of all, sorry, I joined like 30 minutes late, so I probably missed some of the points. But what you said right now, Norman, I see a big gap between context and all these subconscious things on a personal level, because typically nobody is a bad person, and everybody does what he well, they all have good intentions, but most of the time the good intentions don't work out the way everybody wants it to be. And what you just mentioned about walking into the room and experiencing the people, yeah, it's important, but I think that's not the level you need to experience or you need to intervene if you want to change an organization. It's a different level. I completely agree that it's context. But I'd like to have your point of view on where the differences between the context where the people are, like the personal attitudes, values, stuff like that.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I began to adopt the concept of an organization or a collective of people as a living being is because the collective itself have a collective context that's layers on top of the individuals within the organization or within the collective or group. So every individual within the group has its own personal context, but the group has a collective context. And so every individual within the collective or the group is influenced by the collective context. and begins to adopt, take in, integrate some elements of the collective context into their personal context field. They also go the other way as well, so they influence the collective context. So the context isn't necessarily fixed, but the longer the collective is doing a certain thing, it just like the longer we do a certain thing, the pattern, and if you think of it as energy, as patterns of energy, the longer the pattern of energy is repeated over and over again, the more solidified it becomes. So to change it, you got to really put a lot more energy into it to unpack it, dissolve that energy, and create a new energy pattern. So yes, you're right, Wolfgang. There's in reading your thing, there's your chat, there's the individual context, there's the leader context as both an individual, so the leader carries their own context, but they also indirectly or directly are an expression of the context of the collective. So the collective affects the leaders, and they become representatives of the collective, and therefore carry a special meaning, because when they speak, everybody in the collective sees them as the voice of the collective. But they're in the collective, right? They're in a society, or if I'm a business leader, business unit manager, I'm in the collective of the corporation, or I'm in the collective of the belief systems of society that tell me what I'm supposed to do or not do, which could look like the shareholders of stock-owned companies, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody, we look at it as living beings inside living beings inside living beings inside living beings, and it goes on and on and on. I don't know how far out into the universe somewhere. I'm not quite sure how all that works, but bring it closer to Earth. The important thing is when we recognize these are the forces affecting our outcomes, then we shift our efforts from just managing the doing to understand it's time to spend some time on changing our context, understanding the context, making it conscious, and working with it at the multitude of levels that it exists. Does that help? Probably stimulates more questions.
Go ahead.
If I may answer to that, I completely agree. I guess the question I have, or you came up with the idea of the body and the cell and DNA. No? I think the point is maybe it's a matter of consciousness, because, for example, the cells of my body, they won't be aware of the body. If I don't work out, if I lead a lifestyle that is bad for my body, the cell won't be able to recognize, because it's just beyond the level of perception. Similar to probably many organizations. And a person in a leadership role is not necessarily much different from an employee. It's because it's part of the organization, and they're all embedded in a competitive environment, and they're in this industry, and they have shareholders, and all these are narratives and stories that not only the employees, but everybody tells themselves. So either there is, where's the lever? Does it require an external point of view, a consultant, somebody who has an insight that the organization cannot have, because they are within their organization looking through their glasses and not able to, like second order observation, taking off their glasses and observing themselves because they're part. So this is, I think this is the challenge, where to start.
Well, it happens in a couple of ways. Sometimes, and I do think, as you said, it serves an organizational leader to bring in an external viewpoint, a consultant or a coach, because as you point out, we can't see it ourselves. So some of it starts from there. And quite frankly, that's the essence of the work I do, right? Is I work with leaders, and I help them see what their context is, and what the context of the domain they're living in is, and how it's affecting them. So I'm bringing an awareness to that, and I'm also teaching them how to work with that. It's not just making them aware of it, but giving them the tools to do something about it. You'll also see, and this is where we see what is often what I term the aspirational companies, or the model companies everybody's pointing to. Joost de Blok, when he created Buurtzorg, he had an internal dissonance. He came out of the nursing industry and he was disgusted, if I can use such a strong term. He was disgusted with the way the nursing industry was running, and how the context of the industry was fundamentally demeaning the contribution nurses can make and undermining it. And he just had a real strong visceral reaction to it. Just like many of us have a real strong visceral reaction, an internal dissonance that says, my experience context, the world I'm in, is really not working for me, and I want to do something about it. So it can happen two ways. It can happen from an internal dissonance, or it can happen from an external dissonance, a figure, an individual pointing to what's going on to create that awareness. But it always comes from some sense of disconnect or dissonance or disruption, either internally generated or externally generated, to facilitate the change.
All right. I'd like to give the word to Claire Fisher. You were writing your question into the chat. Would you like to comment it and give the context of your question, Claire? Just have to unmute, yeah.
Suzanne, thank you. Thank you for a great talk, Norman. It was really mind-opening. I was just sort of thinking, you started off talking about each department having a personality and a story. So if you can imagine a big organization with, I don't know, 50 or 60 departments, macro, micro departments, revealing the stories, I guess, or the context for each one would probably be quite different. So you'd end up with 60 personalities. So would you have to create or craft stories, a new story for each department, or would it be a holistic story for the organization?
All of the above.
Right.
I like your question. Is a leader a fractal? Yeah, everything's a fractal in the universe. So the answer has to be yes. When I was at HP, it was clear to me that there was a thing called the HP way. It didn't matter whether you were in France, Japan, Australia, East Coast or West Coast of the US. There was a certain common framework, a common context, a common story about what the HP way meant. And in the early days when I first joined HP, it wasn't documented anywhere. It was literally an energy field that you just picked up by osmosis. Later on, they actually began to attempt to document it, but that was in the late 70s, early 80s when that started. And HP was around many years before that. There was also a uniqueness to every one of those entities. So HP in France was very different than HP in Japan and Australia. So they had their own context within the context. So you see how the fractal works, right? The East Coast of the US was very different than the West Coast of the US in the sales region, which is where I spent a lot of my time. But we were still HP. It was very clear we were all HP. And so, and then even within the region, the Western sales region, the southern area was very different than the northern area. Southern California was very different than Northern California. And so it's a fractal within a fractal. And that's just the way it is. When you understand that, you learn how to use it to leverage. And so at a very large corporate level, as a CEO, I would pay attention to what's the collective story, the umbrella story that can accommodate all of these differences and keep them common at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. And Sophie, you were having a question as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the invitation. Thank you very much for the presentation, which has been very clear. My question is relative to the 5 key skills, and I would like to know if they are attended for leaders or for employees or for both.
The answer is both. We start with leaders, but our orientation with leaders is to make them train the trainers. So we don't, the role of the leader is not to be the leader.
Okay.
The role of a leader is to develop everybody else to replace them. That's the short answer.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. And Michael, you were suggesting Norman to say a few words about the training program. And since we're approaching 6 o'clock, which is already the end of our show of today, I find that a very interesting outro. So if you would share some insights about the training program that you
Yeah, let me just, I'll just share my screen real quick and leave up on the screen information about it. So on, we have a workshop we call the Introduction to Leading the Living Organization. It's May 11th, 2021, and it starts at 7 a.m. Pacific time. I invite all of you to consider it. There's a link, go to quantumleaders.com. It literally will walk through all 5 of those skill sets that we talked about. It introduces you to it and how to actually work with those with a leader, right? So this is for change agents. This specific workshop is oriented towards change agents, consultants like all of you. So you can work with leaders. So we teach you the same skills we teach leaders, and also teach you how to implement it with leaders. So everything I talked about today will be moved from a kind of a mental understanding into a much more application focused, experiential embodiment of it to the degree you can in a short period of time. It's a, you can think of it as a 2-day workshop, but it's online and it's spread out over a 5-week period of time. So it's once a week for 2.5 hours a week. So it's not a big time issue. And the fee for it is $17.50 US. So it's not a very expensive workshop. And so I invite everybody to be part of that.
Thank you for sharing this information with us. And as a closing, I'd like to thanks once more our partner Fabric that makes it possible. Represented here with Michael, and I saw somebody else from Fabric too present today. Thank you very much. You make it possible that we can actually offer these sessions free of charge. And I'd like to thank my colleagues from the Next Gen Enterprise, which is Maud and Alix as well. And a very special thanks to you, Norman, to this true inspiring sharing of what you have found and brought from the context of your long year experience to the world through your book and through the speech of today. And
You're so very welcome.
if you had a magic vibe that you could send through the organizations of the world, what would you put into that vibe? Maybe as your last word for tonight.
For me, it comes down to leaders creating the outcomes they want through the development and the maturing of their people. Because as the people mature individually and collectively, it impacts society in such a big way.
Thank
so
you.
Focus on developing people.
Thank you that you've been our guest today. And I thanks for all of you that were listening and contributing with questions to exploring that subject. And I'm looking forward to meeting you soon again on our next Thriving session that you find on the nextgenenterprise.com. And we are listening to some music that Alex is putting on for us while we are saying goodbye. And enjoy the day, Norman, and for all those sitting in Europe, having a nice, wonderful evening. I'm looking
Thank you so much.
Seeing you all soon again. Bye-bye.